Now, to understand portfolio, it's good to revisit some product basics, the basic entities or building blocks of the system, just so you get the model of how it's built around. I've mentioned before that portfolio is structured into these two basic capabilities, data-driven planning and roll-up reporting. Roll-up reporting is pretty straightforward. We simply take all the work items from all the projects together and aggregate them up through the hierarchy to get a picture of progress, how far things are along. Portfolio also aggregates progress for everything that's assigned to a release, so you can see towards an important milestone how far things are along. On the planning side, there is a couple of basic building blocks involved. First of all, as we're talking about planning, it all starts with a plan. A plan contains three basic building blocks. Those are the scope, the people, and releases. If you're an experienced project manager, you'll recognize that these essentially are the most basic building blocks of planning, also referred to as the iron triangle of planning. These are the three dimensions you can play with when you modify a project plan. You can add or remove work out of the scope. You can play with time and cutoff dates, which are marked by releases, or you can add or remove the capacity you have in the people and team section you have available to get the actual work done. Let's look into each of them. In the scope section, the most important entity is the hierarchy of issues. And out of the box, we recommend to structure into initiatives, epics, and user stories. So stories and epics are familiar things you might know from using JIRA software, but portfolio adds additional layering on top of that, just as you get an overview across multiple teams and you look at the bigger scale and bigger aggregation of work, it might make sense to move up the hierarchy. You can actually customize that hierarchy fully now in Portfolio 2 and also add additional levels or rename those existing levels to match better the way you're working. Portfolio also introduces a concept of themes. Themes are typically used to represent business goals or strategic focus areas over the next quarter or the next half a year or year, depending on how long your roadmap is looking into the future. Think of themes rather as something where you're defining for your epic stories or initiatives to which themes, to which business goals do they actually contribute to. So these themes really become an important technique to see if you're focusing on the right set of investments. Is every task that your team executing contributing to something that's really relevant, to something that's making a difference for the business? That's what themes are helpful for. So if you compare initiatives and the concept of themes, we see that initiatives are still bigger pieces of work that you schedule, that you scope, that start and end somewhere on the timeline, versus themes are more of an allocation concept. We focus more on the relative distribution. Are we doing the right set of things? How do we allocate our time? How do we allocate the time across all of our teams? Next, we have the people section. The people section is pretty straightforward. It simply defines teams and team members inside there. Of course, that also comes with modeling things like vacation times, absences, presences, varying weekly hours, all these sort of things. But most essentially, it's built around teams and their team members. And finally, we have the concept of releases, which reflects the time perspective. So in many cases, actually, oftentimes this might tie to actually shipping releases, but we also see in many cases that releases are simply used to represent important milestones. Sometimes it's also just markers in time, like a month or a quarter, in order to align and to plan what can be fitted into that time period, what can actually be achieved, our current plans for that realistic. The releases section basically is structured now by JIRA projects. And for each of the projects, you can have a set of releases. Portfolio 2 also introduces a concept an additional concept. So that's the basic concept of release, a timeline with release markers, and of course structured by projects. Portfolio also introduces now this explicit concept of cross-project releases. That's something that's new in Portfolio 2.0. And essentially what that is used for is to coordinate or align release dates across multiple projects. So think of a bigger deliverable or a bigger milestone that requires the work from multiple teams that are spread out across multiple projects in JIRA. In order to get all these deliverables together to coordinate a joint date, you can model now a cross-project release and see how all the individual projects are tracking towards that joint cross-project release. So summing things up, Portfolio is structured around the iron triangle of planning: scope, people, and releases. The scope section is structured around the configurable issue hierarchy. People define teams and a team's members as well as their availability. And finally, we got the dimension of time in releases, in project-specific releases, as well as cross-project.